Good evening. The last few days, evenings, I should say, I've spent a little time watching the on as well. And as I've watched, I've thought, those are things that I could not do. Watch people play hockey and can't do that. And watch people speed skate and can't really do that. And I watched a boy flip backwards while he was ice skating, and I can't do that. But last night was watching girls ski fast down the hill, and I thought, not I can't do that, I have done that. I believe I was a freshman or sophomore in high school, and it was on Martin Luther King Day, I believe, Sunday night / Monday. And Paoli, Indiana, you could go ski overnight. It was like an all-night skiing thing. This is the only time I've ever been skiing in my life. Dad took me. Dad had been several times. And after a cursory trip down the bunny trail, I knew I was ready for the big time. More than anything, it was these two also 16-year-old girls beside me that I thought, well, this would be impressive to get to talk to. And I talked to them, and they weren't as intrigued with me, I don't think. They skied on down the hill, and I thought, well, maybe later. Well, later came quicker, because as I went down the hill, I realized I hadn't paid any attention on the practice run. And I was going quite literally the same speed that those girls on the Olympics were going last night. And if you're curious, if you think you might be able to pick up women, undercutting them both as you're skiing 85 miles an hour is not at all the best approach. I got up, got on the chairlift, and said, maybe next time. So I came away. Well, I left the way I got there. I was single, but I was hurting a lot more after it was over with. This series of lessons is going to finish tonight, or if you're looking at my paper, it was going to finish on January the 28th. My worry was that we didn't really have enough to talk about, and I was just going to kind of recap it. As you can see from the title there, Lessons Learned. I was going to recap that. It actually might be a real recap since we went about 3 weeks without talking about it. But we're going to kind of review and talk about a few things as we sort of wrap it up here this evening. We've talked a lot in the last, I believe there were 7 lessons. This is the 7th lesson about the genealogy of Jesus. And over the course of several weeks, we've discussed several things, and you can see them all there on the screen. We talked about why it mattered. We talked about comparisons and differences in the versions of Matthew and the versions of Luke. We talked about how Jesus was connected to Abraham and how Jesus was connected to David and how it mattered for both. We talked about Mary in particular, Jesus' mother, and then also mentioned some of the other women that were mentioned there. Well, some of that had been discussed in a Sunday morning sermon, so we didn't get as in-depth on that. And then we talked about how it ended the Levitical priesthood. I believe that was the last time that we were together. And so when we think about this series of lessons, I hope the main point is what you see written really large there at the top, that God always keeps his word. That's complicated and difficult for us at times, because it doesn't always work the way we think it would work or at the speed that we think it would work. But God made promises to Abraham, to David, and to the people through the teaching and writing of Isaiah. And we saw that in verses fulfilled in the New Testament. And so when we think about that, we think, well, that was a long time ago. And then I guess the New Testament was a not as long time ago, but we live right here. Well, if the long ago, I sound like Brent Baker, if the long ago happened, it came through in the middle, then maybe the middle will come through for us. And that's what we see here. We can have confidence that that will continue. Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Jill, would you care to read that for us, please, dear? I think that was it. Yeah. And so this is the first chapter of the book of Acts. As you'll remember, in all of the Gospels, they end essentially with Jesus dead, buried, and resurrected in some form of telling. They end slightly different in what they focus on. But this is just a handful of verses afterwards. And if you're in Acts chapter 1, verses 4 through about 8 is heavily, is a lot of it is red. It's Jesus talking. But then we see Jesus leave after that. And what we see here is a promise that can be comforted to us. And I like to think when we look at verses 9, 10, and 11, especially verses 10 and 11, it said, while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, and I think this quote here in verse 11 is important for us. It said, men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? Well, I would dare say that had I been in that position, I probably would have been gazing up into heaven as well. This would have been something that would have caught me. But it said, this same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. And essentially, the way that I would read that right there is the way that we could maybe read it as well. We can spend a lot of time sort of gazing up into heaven, right? But a lot of time, honestly, all time spent gazing up into heaven is probably wasted time, right? Just wait. But instead of looking and waiting for him to come back, there's things that can be done. Okay? There's work that can be done. There are tasks that can be done. There's studying that can be done. There are ways to help people all the time. And I'm sure when promises were made to Abraham, promises were made to David, promises were made through Isaiah, people spent time, literally or metaphorically, staring up into heaven, waiting for those promises to come true. But instead of doing that, the time could be better spent doing the will of God. And so I want us to kind of think about that. But the amount of time between promise and fulfillment was big. And was it all great during that time? Everything went well for thousands of years, right? No, most things didn't go well. You could hardly turn 2 pages in the Bible before things went bad. Does that sound similar to us? We have promises made for the future, right? But does everything always go well for us? Honestly, not very often, right? For every time something goes good, something bad will happen, right? And we joked about this several months ago. I think I was joking with Linda about the hot water heater tearing up or something like that's a minuscule thing. But point being, nothing ever goes perfectly, right? Nothing ever goes perfectly. But sometimes those struggles and failures are what we focus too much on and kind of a woe is me rather than trying to go up into it. Well, we can be comforted as we see here that the same promise will be filled today, even though we have struggles and difficulties as well. And so hopefully that'll be comforting for us. I've got a bunch of questions that we're going to ask tonight. And not going to necessarily be go to this verse and read this because it's kind of a wrap up of a lot of things that we've talked about. But I want you to answer, I want you to think about, and I want you to consider the questions that we pose right here. And hopefully we'll be able to get some good thoughts from it. First question. Why do you think the gospel writers, this is Matthew and Luke, included the genealogy of Jesus rather than beginning immediately with his ministry? Okay. Establishes who he is, the right to have that. Uh-huh. 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 Sure. Absolutely. Any others? Say it again. Uh-huh. So it's a set of precedents that went over all good. What else? What else might it be important? Right. Sure. Mm-hmm. Ben? Okay. Any others? So when we think about this, it does sort of set the stage, and it's Matthew chapter 1 and it's Luke chapter 3. Not all the books talk about this. It's interesting that Mark doesn't have this, and John, which was written much later, doesn't have it either. I think there's some validity probably for why it's not in John, but they don't have this teaching. But this was it deemed important. We've talked about how the different gospels were written in many were written for different groups of people, and hopefully, and I think that's maybe why it's included in some and not the other. What does the genealogy teach us about God's faithfulness across generations?
You see it play out. You see, just because we are faithful, we get to God, His faithfulness never wavers, never questions, never questions at all.
Sure.
That's all it runs. We know it counts.
Others.
Well, if you read the chapter, some of these people were not very good people,
Uh-huh.
and some were real good people. But God prompted it to go back.
Uh-huh.
Regardless of how they might live their part of it.
Certainly.
I think the reason too, or one of the main reasons the gospel didn't include it is because it wasn't questioned.
Yeah.
That they had the proof, they could go back there, they could look it up. So the fact that they didn't feel the need to address it kind of says, okay, this is pretty well established.
I've always thought that the Gospel of it was Matthew and Luke cover it. The Gospel of Mark doesn't. If you've ever read the book of Mark, he says, and this happened, and this happened. Not exactly like that. I feel like 17 verses of genealogy would have just been too slow for the Gospel of Mark. Like, well, we're killing time. Let's get to something better. Mary. No. Uh-huh. 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 Sure. So it covers a large period of time. I think we talked about that a few weeks ago when we were covering the genealogy or the list of names. And I asked you, I believe, who was your grandparent, right? And all of us were able to say the name of our parents and our grandparents. And for a lot of us, maybe our great grandparents. But much beyond that, it gets a little tougher, right? Because you didn't know them. You had no real experience with them. You might have a piece of furniture or a story passed down, but that's about it. And so when we look at this third question, the time span is huge. Okay. And so if you were to look at Matthew chapter 1 and you were to go to say verse 4 and verse, I don't know, 14 and put your finger on two different people and you said, person in verse 14, do you know person in verse 4? What's the answer to that most likely going to be? No, didn't know them at all. Had no connection to them other than family, right? It's the same way with us. If we go back 14 generations, we're not going to know them either. But all of that was moving toward something that happened. And there were fits and there were starts. There were wrong turns that we can look back at now, but God was still working with them. So the long span covering the genealogy, what does it tell us about the patience of God? Job couldn't come close to it.
Well, we can't keep looking at things in a time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Basketball game, 48 years.
Right.
We can't keep doing that because you got to get work at 7 time, get off at 7 time, you got to get church at 6
Right.
That's not God.
Right.
I think that keeps us from being patient we need to be because there's a kicking clock there that dictates really our whole life.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We struggle with patience because so much of our life is dictated by, that you can't tell the boss to be patient when you're late 3 days in a row, right? That's right. I'm going to go over real well. But it's hard for us to see sort of big picture, broad scope right there. But God's ways, the Bible says, are not our ways. And we struggle with that. But I hope that we would strive to maybe recognize it a little bit better. I'm worse about it than anybody. Why do you think the scripture includes people with moral, it probably should just say moral failures, with moral failures, moral and personal failures in Jesus's lineage? Why are there bad guys in Matthew chapter 1? Sure, be hard to relate to. Why else? Uh-huh. Right. From all kinds, yeah. What else for that first question? Would it be fair to have went in and marked out the quote unquote bad guys? Had we done that, how many people's names would we have marked out? Every one of them, right? You'd have marked out every one because the Bible says that all have what? All have sinned. And that means all this. So when we look at it, we look at that and we say, okay, the guy in verse 3, pretty good. The guy in verse 9, oh, that's pretty bad, right? Well, what are we doing when we say something like that? We're judging, yeah. We're kind of ranking sins there just a little bit, maybe, right? And we're doing that. But Jesus would come to die for who? For all. Will. In some cases, it could be the case as well. And so I want us to think about that for the second question. What hope does the genealogy offer to those, and I say those meaning me and you, who might feel unworthy to be used by God? Mm-hmm. Others? If we had to be perfect, it would have been a one verse. It'd have been a one verse. It'd have been an easy read, right? It wouldn't have took long to read it if we had to be perfect. But as Ben said right there, it's sort of all of them are moving the story forward, right? They're all moving the story. And our job is to do the same thing. And we will make mistakes. All of us will make mistakes. All of us will have made them in the past. And I dare say that unless you fell over right now, you'll make them in the future, right? But our job is to sort of move the story forward. How do we move the story forward in 2026?
Don't let our failures of 2025 anchor us to 2025.
Sure.
Let it go. Move on.
Sure.
Don't beat yourself up over it. Don't beat anybody else up over it either. Don't judge people or condemn people as not worthy of your time or your effort.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of the situation they found themselves in.
Sure.
Groucho Marx said, "I'll never be a member of the club that can have me for a minute."
All right.
We've all done something. Some
Sure.
let that hold us back, letting that judge color our business somewhere.
Uh-huh.
You might well.
Right.
You can change.
Right.
Forget that and move on. Press on towards the mark.
It's been a while back, but I preached about that. But there can be, there may be punishments. There are people that have forgotten the past, but are in jail right now because they're having to be punished for mistakes that were made. But there have been changes made in their life as well. Go ahead. Sure. Probably harder than. Mm-hmm.
We've got to recognize a big part of that. Some of it is just us. Some of it is it is us, part of it. We get credit for it too, part of it. And we need to turn that voice out.
Other thoughts? So when I asked this question, you guys actually kind of went in a slightly different direction than I was thinking. But I have a tendency to sometimes read the Bible as something that happened over there, right? Not unlike, reading, if you read, if you go to the library this afternoon and get a book that's a work of fiction, right? And you're reading about these characters or whatever, and it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to meet this person. These are people that are way over there. If I go to the library this afternoon and read something that's happened here recently, there's a chance I can meet a person that's actually in that. And I think sometimes if we're not careful, we read the Bible in sort of that way. It's like there's people that things happened to a while back over here, and I'm just kind of almost like a bystander watching over it. But I don't think the people that are in the Bible were thinking when they were living, wow, I bet they'll write this down someday, right? It was just sort of that they were sort of living their life. Well, I'm not saying that there's going to be a Bible that comes out 2,000 years from now, but in many ways, when we think about this last question, we might feel unworthy to be used by God, but I'm sure there were people that ended up in the Bible that probably felt the same way, right? And so we can't think about it that way. We have to think about doing what we can to sort of move it forward. It's not going to be another Bible, but there may be people, the work that we do will carry on even beyond us. I'm sorry. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Right. Sure. Mm-hmm. Get through it. Mm-hmm. And I think that was kind of the direction we were leaning with this right now. Will the church exist 100 years after you die? Well, sure. Sure, but it will, but you won't necessarily know it, right? So we can't just assume that it would, right? So we have to work to try, and whatever happens 100 years after I'm gone, it will just happen, right? I can't, and I think we sometimes fret and worry about what will happen 100 years beyond us, and we spend more time worrying about 100 years from now rather than what can I do right here. That was kind of the direction I was going with the question, but I appreciate your all's answers there as well. I think it's significant that Gentiles and women appear in Jesus's genealogy. Why might that be significant? Yeah. Absolutely. Others? Sure. So in that second question that we see up there, just the fact that there are people in Jesus's lineage that were different than him, that were not great necessarily. And I know we talked about that just a minute ago, but it's kind of all of this group. Whenever we open the door and somebody's standing at that door that has not been in here before, what should we do? invite them in, welcome them with open arms. Does the church always do that? Uh-huh. But it's not a guarantee that it would, right? But we can only do what we can. But I think sometimes the church maybe gets a negative, and let me say the church, let me just say Christianity in general, sometimes maybe gets a negative impression because you look at this person and you say, well, here's the 3 things immediately wrong with that person. Well, there are 3 things wrong with me, and y'all let more than 3 things, y'all let me go up there every week, But our goal there should be to kind of reflect back on the people that was in Jesus's line and what pushed it forward as well. Tom, are you going to say something? Uh-huh. Sure. And I get frustrated with myself when I do that because it's really easy, to fall into that. All right, couple more here before we wrap things up. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You should never know. Never know. What does it mean to be part, and we mentioned this a minute ago, but what does it mean to be part of God's family through faith rather than through ancestry?
Well, that's a big important one for us because all those people you mentioned.
Yep.
You know how many of them was white? None of them. So faith versus lineage, we get to jump right in.
If it was lineage, we wouldn't be there, right? Remember we talked about that. Jesus had to come from certain tribes, and it was open to certain tribes, and the Gentiles it wasn't available for them to start with. But we can't pass the lineage test, but can we pass the faith test? So how do we become part of the ancestry of Jesus? Well, not the ancestry. How do we become part of the family of Jesus by faith rather than ancestry? How do we today? Have to be through the church. Into Christ. You have the choice, though, right? You have the choice. You've heard people say you can't pick your family, right? And, there's probably been times when you went to the reunion and thought, oh, I just hope they're not there, right? Or if they're there, the police will probably be there 10 minutes later. You probably thought that before, right? But when you say, I want to be part of God's family, it requires action, right? Is faith an action? Sure it is. And it requires an action. But you're not required to be part of it, right? There are people right now choosing not to be. That's their decision, right? That is what's different right there. We can be part of God's family through faith. Ben often uses the term adoption, right? And we're not born into it, so to speak, but we have to make the decision. How many of you know people whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents all went to church, all were Christians, and then they had no interest in it at all? Well, you would say they're born into it, right? But what did they not do? They didn't choose to be part of it, and that's a choice. We have that choice. That's why it's faith rather than ancestry. Number 2, why is spiritual lineage more important than physical lineage under the new covenant?
We talked about this before, but adoption carries so many more legal requirements than natural born son. If you was adopted, you couldn't be the son.
Mm-hmm.
If you was adopted, they couldn't do some of these different things that they could do to the natural. It got you a lot of extra. And it's the same way with us, I think.
Well,
In the old law, family pretty much decides like how your life is going to go. And under the new covenant, it's like it doesn't matter if it's family, right? What your family name is, like you can do like anything that you want. And that even means like in the spiritual sense too, like Levi, you were be a priest.
mm-hmm.
Now, like obviously we don't have priests in our in Christianity, but anybody who can be a Christian, not just
When we talk about a spiritual Go ahead, Tom. Absolutely. It's a good lead into the question I was going to ask. You all can all probably think about or remember people that were members of the church here that have passed on, right? And if we go back, there's been all kinds of people. And if we were to make a list of those names, I could hold that list up and some of you would say, oh, I know that person. But there'd be some names on there that you would say, I don't know who that person is. Are you related to them spiritually? Yeah, they're in the lineage, right? Just within this place. They are within, so you're connected. So think about all those people that we are connected through spiritually, rather than the physical or the ancestral, right? Well, we can't really pick the ancestral lineage, but we choose to be part of the spiritual. Last question. How should belonging to God's family influence the way we treat one another?
That's probably been one of the bigger influences that I've got, especially the older I get. I view Christians as my family, a true family. The love I have for them is genuine and real, and when you got that, it's a lot easier to treat them better than they deserve.
Yeah.
Easier for them to treat me better than I deserve. If I got what I deserve, I'd be in trouble. But that love helps us and freaking helps and shapes our Christianity. People were going to be in heaven.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And people that we might have looked at and said didn't deserve to be treated as well as he treated it, right? Ben?
God has said if you can't love your brother, so you know beyond no doubt in your mind that person is there. You see it, you smell and touch it. If you can't love them, if you can't master that, how are you ever going to love them? You can't see them.
Other than the 4 minutes between when I was born and Jess was born, we were together, I guess, pretty much our whole life growing up. And there is not a single person in my life that would get madder about poor treatment of me than Jessica would. Now, quite often, Jess and I argued and pushed and shoved and fussed with each other. It's okay if she did it. But if you did it, she's madder than fire. Because that's how much she loved me as a family member. Well, I don't know that we need to get in fights over it, but should we feel the same way about fellow Christians in this building? What about fellow Christians around the world? Absolutely. And I know you, but I don't know them, but I should feel the same way right there. How that we treat one another should be modeled after what Jesus did. Jesus's mercy and compassion. He humbled himself when he went to the earth, came in the likeness of men. We've talked about this countless times. Jolita just said it there just a minute ago. But Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Mel, I'll let you read it since you mentioned it a minute ago. So. And so we see this much later after the fact that Jesus experienced a life very similar to the life that people of his time experienced, and very similar to the life that we experience as well. He did it for a few reasons. This is a longer reading, and I'm going to read this. This is Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. We're going to read this, the whole chapter of Hebrews chapter 2. But there are 4 things that I want us to look for. 4 reasons why Jesus came to the earth, lived as he did. Okay, so we're looking for 4 things within. We'll start right here. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. For the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? God also bearing witness both with signs and wonders, with various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. For he has not put the world to come, of which we speak, in subjection to angels. But one testified in a certain place, saying, What is man that you are mindful of him, of the Son of Man that you take care of him? You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and set him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we do not yet see all things put under him. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will sing praise to you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For indeed, he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. Therefore, in all things, he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. I want us to look at four things right here. And if you have your Bible, you'll be able to read it. But these four things that we see. One, why did he do it? To taste death for everyone. And that's Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9. We don't have the ability to taste death for anybody, right? Except for who? Ourselves. And we don't have the ability to even report back on that, right? But he did that to be able to taste death for everyone. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 10, to help bring us to glory. I think the actual verse said many sons to glory right there. And so to came to earth to open the door for other folks. Number 3, Hebrews 2, 14 and 15, to deliver us from the fear and power of death. In the verses there, verse 14 and 15, the people were nervous, right? They were scared. There was a concern. What will happen after this life is over? We still face those concerns. We still have those worries here. But Jesus, in his teaching, was hopeful to deliver us from that. We don't have to worry about that kind of fear or that kind of concern. In the last 3 verses, to become our merciful and faithful high priest. Not a high priest that was there because they were a Levite, not a high priest because the people had elected them or whatever, but to be a merciful and faithful high priest, ranking higher than anybody else could rank. So I want to leave you with this question. And I don't know that you have to answer, but I want you to think about it as we leave tonight. If someone asked why the genealogy of Jesus matters today, how would you explain its value to them? I don't want you to answer. I just want you to think about that and go home with that question here this evening. I thank you for being with